So far we've been getting some cool clumping results just based on that noise on the attraction weight attribute, but sometimes we want more direct manual control over where these grains are clustered together. And this is particularly important when perhaps a supervisor or a director requests very specific clump shapes in specific areas, and these kinds of requests pop up all the time in production, and it's good to have techniques to handle that in a manual way. So I'm going to use this noisy sphere here to create some glue clusters on our grains, and we're just going to use this sphere to group our grain points. Actually, the grains are at a different scale than I set up this sphere shape here, so I'm just going to make a reference copy of that creature scale. Create reference copy there so that we scale down this noisy sphere as well. And then we can drop in a group SOP and put that on our grains, connect the second input to the sphere that we're grouping with. And the group name I'll call constraint clump, and turn off the base group, and we're going to use points and keep in bounding region, and we'll use a bounding object from that second input. So you can see here we have this specific region of our grains all grouped, and then we can use that to generate some glue constraints just in that area. So let's drop in a vellum constraints SOP, put that after the group here, and you can see that's automatically connected the second input to the upstream grain constraints there. So we have our grains going into one side of this vellum constraints, and the grain constraints themselves going into the second input, so it all gets combined together. So that's all good. We want to include the previous constraints when we're creating new ones. And then on the vellum constraints here, we're going to select a constraint type of glue, and for the group, we're going to flip this to points and select the constraint clump group. And the min and max search distance for creating these constraints, I'm going to base on the grain size from our vellum constraints grain here. So let's select that, and we'll copy that grain size parameter, and let's paste a relative reference into the minimum search distance. And I want the min search distance to be perhaps a little bit less than the grain size. So let's try something like 0.9 times that size there. And the maximum search distance for creating constraints between grains will be just a bit larger than that grain size. Let's try 1.5. And now if we take a look at what the constraints look like after this glue step here, this can be a little bit hard to see visually because we have all of the grain constraints stacked on top of the new glue ones that are being created. And if we middle mouse here, actually it looks like we're not getting any glue constraints created just yet. So when you middle mouse on the second input to the vellum constraints glue, you can see that previously we have 149,000 grain constraints that are generated by the vellum constraints grain step, but we don't have any additional constraints coming out of our glue step here. And this may be because our target geometry is set to primitives, when with grains we're working with points. So let's flip that to points there, and sure enough we had some grain constraints now being generated where there weren't before. Now the grain constraints that were originally generated by the vellum constraints grain here are going to be points because it's just, some information about each individual grain point that's being added to the sim. And the constraints that are being generated by the glue here are going to be primitives because they define connections between two different grains. So if you middle mouse on the vellum constraints grain output, you see in addition to the 149,000 points that we had for our grains constraints before, we now have an additional 5,000 primitives being added there. And in order to just see the newly created constraints, we could just use a clean SOP after this vellum constraints here to delete the stray points. So if you connect that to the second output here, then this will just temporarily get rid of any points that aren't part of primitives, and this leaves just the new grains that we're creating here. And it looks like, we have a fair amount of connections happening within this clustered region, but we want perhaps a bit more of a thorough network of constraints here so that you have all the grains pretty tightly held together. And right now the vellum constraints are only generating one constraint per point, which means that it's possible we might not have a very solid network of connections here. So we can increase this to 4 constraints per point, and we can potentially optimize things by turning down the max surge points if you want. I think 8 and 4 works pretty well to give us a pretty thorough network of grain constraints here. And then in terms of the simulation behavior, we can now set the stiffness for these glue constraints. And this is something that you may need to play around with in your simulation, but I found that a stiffness of 1000 worked pretty well for my purposes here. And now with these constraints created, this will automatically be picked up by our DOPNet because the DOPNet is just looking for constraints for the vellum solver in this second input of the DOPNet there. So let's do a flipbook and see what this new sim looks like. Now our new simulation flipbook kind of looks like the constraints are working properly, but this might be a little bit misleading because this area that we added the manual constraints to just so happens to also be an area of strong attraction weight. So if you take a look at the color feedback for the attraction weight on these grains, you can see we have this large clump pretty much in the same area that we've specified the glue constraints. So we often want to simplify our simulations when we're debugging things to make sure they're all working as expected. So what I want to check here is if this clumping that's happening in that region is due to the attraction weight or if it's due to the constraints. So I've run another simulation here where I've turned off the glue constraints and let this only use attraction weight, and you can see there's a slight difference between these sims, but they're quite similar. So if we take a look at this version that only uses that attraction weight, the results are almost the same. So we really want to make sure that our glue constraints are working properly. So what I would recommend here is to bypass the large clumps so that we turn off this strong large clumping behavior here. We only get this kind of smaller clump behavior, which is fine. That's not going to throw off our debugging at all. And when we do a simulation with this, we're going to see that that main clump area isn't really held together very well anymore. So you can see we're kind of getting some grains sticking together a bit in that area. It's kind of making some attempt to hold those grains together, but it's not working very well. So we're going to need to debug this and try to tighten up that grain clumping behavior with our constraint settings for that glue. So going back to our glue constraints set up here, we could potentially just crank up the stiffness. And sometimes with vellum sims, you have to go with really large constraint values, and oftentimes you'll need to increase this by multiple factors of 10. They give us this drop down here if you want to quickly control what factors of 10 you're working with, or of course you can just change it on the value itself. So in this case, I'm going to try making this jump up from 1000 on that stiffness up to, let's try 100,000 to see if that has a better effect. And I'm going to make sure that braking is not enabled, and it's not, so that's fine. We don't have to worry about that. And with that glue constraint stiffness turned up a lot, now we can do another flipbook to see if it holds that section together a bit better than it was before. And for the sake of debugging this constraint behavior, I've turned off this large clump attraction weight for now, at least until we make sure that our glue constraints are working properly. So now our new simulation with that stiffness cranked up to 100,000 does look like it's holding together that section a little bit better than it was before, but it's still breaking up a fair bit. And this may be because we need to get a more thorough constraint network with all the grains connecting to each other a bit more. And we can also try increasing the stiffness a bit further to try to tighten that behavior up as well. So back on the vellum constraints here, I'm going to just turn up the stiffness again by a factor of 10. We're up to 1,000,000 now, and looking at our clean SOP, where that'll isolate just the glue constraints we're adding, you can see that there are some sections that are not actually connected to each other. So it looks like there are a whole bunch of gaps between our grain particle connections here. So we can make some changes to this constraint network that it's creating. We can try increasing the number of constraints per point. Let's set that to 6 instead. And now we're getting much better coverage and a much more thorough web of constraints that are connecting all of the grains here. We could also potentially turn down the minimum search distance a bit in case for some reason we have grains a little bit closer together than the grain size should allow. It doesn't really look like that's making a difference, so that is fine either way. 0.9 or 0.8 work just fine. And at this point we're creating lots of constraints here. We're up to 45,000 constraints, and when you add tons and tons of constraints, it can increase the simulation time, so you might not want to go too crazy with this, but sometimes there's no other way and you just need to throw lots of constraints at the sim. So in this case, let's see how much worse it is when we go up to 8 constraints per point. And it's not a huge amount more. That's getting up to 56,000 here. And I think that's quite a bit more coverage than we had before. So let's take another look at this with a more thorough constraint network and also with that stiffness increased a bit more than it was, and see what our new simulation looks like. So now reviewing our new simulation with the extra constraints and the cranked up stiffness, you can see that this is much more successful in terms of holding together that section that we've glued together there, but the simulation has gotten a bit unstable. So there are a few things that we could do to address this. We could try increasing substeps to see if that helps. And there are perhaps a couple other grain properties we could play around with in the solver. But since things were behaving in a much more stable way before, I'm going to try just backing off on some of the changes we made to the glue constraints. We can try reducing the stiffness and reducing the number of constraints per point a little bit to get something a little bit in between what we had before and what we have now. So back on our vellum constraints glue here, I'm going to go down to 6 constraints per point, and I'm going to take the stretch stiffness way down because I feel like the main issue we had before was not enough coverage with enough grains being connected to each other. I don't think it was as much a stiffness issue. So I'm going to try just setting the stiffness to 1000 instead of 1,000,000. And with 6 constraints per point, let's see if our simulation behaves in a bit more of a stable fashion. In this case, the updates to the glue constraints aren't really fixing the problem. Reducing the constraints per point and reducing the stiffness have given us some slightly nicer behavior, because you can see that the tentacles are kind of bending a bit more while staying glued to each other. So this sort of bend and flex in these tentacle stubs here does look a bit nicer than when it's perfectly rigid. So the settings that we've changed here do seem a bit better in terms of what those glue constraints are doing. But the sim is still exploding quite a bit, so we'll need to do a little bit more debugging to stabilize our simulation. So one thing we can do is go back to the DOPNet here, and we could increase the substeps quite a bit. That could potentially help. And back on the Advanced tab for the Vellum solver, you could play around with the repulsion amount, and that could potentially help to calm things down a little bit. In this particular case, I'm going to just try some more substeps. And this mass shock here is largely for grains that are piling on the ground so that it can resolve those different layers of collisions more nicely. And I'm going to leave it on in this case where we're colliding with the ground here, but for the disintegration effect where this is kind of all just falling apart in midair without stacking up on the ground, that's less relevant. So you could potentially turn off enable mass shock once this creature's flying through the air. But for now, let's just see what our sim looks like with doubling these substeps up to 10. And unfortunately, increasing the substeps to 10 didn't really do anything to improve the simulation. It's still kind of unstable, and that clustered section is still exploding upwards quite a bit. Wasn't really helpful. So investigating this a little bit further and playing around with a few different things, I found that the main thing that fixed this particular case was turning down the mass shock scaling. And this is one of the challenges of effects work because there are so many different ways that things can go wrong in simulations, and it's really just a matter of playing around with the most likely culprits, cranking them up to extremely high levels, down to extremely low levels, try to see which ones are having an appreciable effect on the simulation. So increasing substeps up and down wasn't really changing our result very much. Changing the stiffness on our glue constraints wasn't changing things much either. And I actually found that we don't really need to crank this stiffness way up. I had it set to 1,000 to make sure these particles would be held together well, but it seems like those glue constraints work just fine with a stiffness of 1. And sure, it can be a little bit time consuming to test out some of the various problem points, but the more you work on these types of effects, the more you can kind of identify where the problem areas are likely to be. So when it comes to these grain instabilities, we can, as you've seen, we can reduce our stiffnesses to make sure that we don't have ridiculously strong constraints doing weird things. You could try playing around with the damping ratio. I played around with that a bit, but it didn't help us out at all. That's another option, though, that you can certainly investigate. Another common problem for instability in grain sims is if the grains are overlapping each other quite a bit. So, for example, if we put a transform on our grains here, I'll just put this off to the side, connect it to our vellum constraints grain. And then on this transform, I'm going to scale this down a bit. I'll try a value of 0.7. And then zooming in on these grain particles here, you can see that these grains are actually overlapping each other a bit in some areas. And this is another thing that can cause some instability or issues with your grain sims. And in this particular example, the reason that this is problematic to scale these grains down, and the reason it causes these overlaps, is because the p-scale of the grains isn't changing based on this transform. So if I bring up the attribute spreadsheet, we currently have a p-scale of 0.15, and as we enable or disable our transform stop here, we aren't getting any change in our p-scale. So this is an important thing to watch out for when setting up your grain sims, especially if you're setting up the grains in a rest space and then applying some animation to those grains that could potentially be in a slightly different space as far as scaling is concerned. These types of scaling issues are very important to keep track of with grain sims. And we can manually fix this after a transform like this. So when we scale this down by 0.7 here, we could drop in an attribute adjust float, and this is actually defaulting to adjust the p-scale, and we can set this to adjust with a constant. I'll set this to multiply, and for that uniform scale I'm going to copy this from the transform that we're doing right here. I'll copy that parameter and I'll paste the relative reference into our attribute adjust float here, so that this will always change the p-scale along with the transformation that's being applied here. So let's look at the spreadsheet on the attribute adjust float. You can see this p-scale is being turned down here, and as we adjust this transform scaling on these grains, you can see we're not running into any issues with grain overlap anymore, because we have this attribute adjust float that's automatically compensating for this change in scale. So those overlapping grains are another possible problem that you can run into. And then going back into the DOPNet and looking at a couple of things here that you can watch out for. If you go back to the Vellum solver and our grain collisions under the Advanced tab, you can tone down the overall grain behavior with this global weight here, which will serve as a multiplier on the repulsion weight and attraction weight, and I believe on the friction as well. Some of these things are pretty well documented. So if you bring up the help docs for the Vellum solver, you can see that this global weight option, it tells you exactly what is being scaled with that here. It's scaling repulsion weight, attraction weight, and friction. And if you're really running into problems with a grain sim, I encourage you to take a good read through all of these different settings to get an understanding of how they all work. We don't really have the time to do a super deep dive into each individual setting, but as for fixing problems or stabilizing the sim, you can try turning down the global weight a bit. I tested that with this sim, it didn't really help. You can also try turning down the repulsion, which I also tested and it didn't help. And in this particular case, the thing that I found made the big difference was this mass shock here. If I turn that off, the problem goes away, but then we don't really have the added benefit of this mass shock functionality that helps particles to settle on top of each other when they're all colliding with the ground. And this is another thing that's pretty well documented in the help files here. So looking into the Vellum solver help, it says that the mass shock is artificially scaling the mass of particles according to their position with respect to gravity, so that the particles on top of a pile of grains will be considered lighter than the ones down below, and this just helps it to converge faster, as it says here, and allows it to create these more stable stacks of grain particles when they're piling up due to those collisions. And they do have a warning here that too high a number on this shock scaling power can make higher particles extremely light and destabilize the system, which kind of looks like the issue that we were seeing with our previous problematic sim. When we play back this flipbook of this problematic simulation, this does look like, some particles are appearing to be very lightweight and unstable. So this does kind of align with what the help docs are warning us about with respect to the mass shock and that shock scaling. And once we have this creature disintegrating in the air, we can turn off this mass shock entirely, because these disintegrating particles flowing through the air don't really need to pile up in the way that this mass shock is trying to achieve. So in that case, it's totally fine to turn it off. But in this particular case where we want these grains to all collide on the ground, we probably do want to keep some mass shock enabled. So in this particular case, I turned it down to about 0.25, and that was sufficient to give us a nice and stable grain simulation. So this looks pretty good. We have the clumping visible from our smaller scale noise. We have these glue constraints working really nicely. We kind of have this nice bending and flexing behavior and these stubs of tentacles there. And this is all looking pretty good. This is kind of what we expect to see. So when you run into problems, it can be a little bit time consuming to get in there and find the source of the problem, but hopefully these few things to focus on that I've outlined will help you to debug any potential issues a bit faster. And now that we have this nice large chunk of our creature being held together, this should add some nice visual interest to our simulation once we get a bit further with this disintegration effect in midair.